For those of you who have never been to Tokyo, the city is bustling and busy up until midnight. Once midnight hits, the train system shuts down, so if you're on the train at 11:59 and it's about to turn midnight, the train will go to the next stop on its track, and then everyone has to get off. You spend many nights in Tokyo planning how late you can stay out and still get home without having to walk 3 to 4 stops distance. This night my friend and I messed up and ended up having to get off the Yamanote line, probably the most famous line in Tokyo, 4 stops before where we lived. Knowing only the vague direction we had to head home, east, we got off at a station at midnight and started walking. Around the corner from the station there was a businessman in his 30s or so, face down on the ground. Now in Japan it is not uncommon for people to get drunk and pass out in public places, so I didn't think anything of it and went up to him to ask him if he was okay. After asking him a few times if he was alright, he neither moved nor responded, and then I noticed that not only was he sprawled out on the ground, but his cell phone was also several feet away from his outstretched hand, as if he had just collapsed while on his phone. Not sure what to do, I looked to my friend for help. At that exact moment, a car came zooming down the narrow street and stopped at a grinding halt by us. The driver, a young Japanese guy, looked at us first, then looked at the man on the ground. He asked the man if he was all right and got no response. Then the situation hit him, and he saw me and my friend, 2 foreigners, standing over what could have been a dead man on the ground. He clearly got spooked and drove off without pushing the issue further. Based on how strange the situation was, and how impossible it would be to explain even in English and not look like we had hurt or killed the guy, my friend and I decided to get out of there as quickly as possible, and we took off, following the tracks as best we could to get home ASAP. About 20 minutes later, near the next station, who do we run into smoking a cigarette? The guy who had pulled up in the car next to us. He seemed visibly still shaken. He glanced at me, and I at him, and once he realized where he had saw me from, he put his cigarette out at inhuman speed, got in his car, and sped off. That was the last we saw of him. For years my friend and I would randomly discuss what had happened to the guy in the car, as well as if the guy in the street was actually dead or not. I wish I would have helped the guy on the ground, but I was a scared college student afraid of being put in Japanese jail. To start off, I had just finished my junior year in high school, and my Japanese language class was taking a trip to Japan to learn more about the language and culture. A friend of mine, and now girlfriend, who was unable to take Japanese that year asked to come along, and was allowed to by our teacher. The trip was 13 days, and covered a lot of ground in Japan. This friend, who we'll call Sarah, has a history of horrible headaches and migraines, but neither surfaced during our trip, except for one. We were in Kyoto, about to watch a performance of various types of Japanese theater, and had showed up a bit early. While we were in line to buy our tickets, Sarah started looking a bit distressed, and I asked her what was wrong. One of her headaches was coming on, and I had no clue what to do. I only knew it was going to get horrible. In an attempt to relieve her pain, I offered to take her to buy some coffee. Caffeine helps headaches. The great thing about Japan is that there are vending machines everywhere, and more often than not, they'll have hot and cold coffee cans in them. So I'm walking her down to the main street in the Gion district, looking left and right down alleys for one of these vending machines. After a few minutes, I see one in a shady-looking alleyway. As we get to the vending machine, I start pulling enough yen out of my pocket and have enough for 3 drinks. I was relatively hot, so I ended up buying a Coke for myself and 2 coffees for her, the other just in case it happens again. As she's picking up the cans from the vending area, I notice a man out of the corner of my eye, roughly 25 feet down. He gets up from the wall he was leaning on and starts making his way down towards us. Naturally, I shrug it off and assume he is going in one of the buildings in the alley. We start walking back to the theater house by means of the alleys because they were much quieter and Sarah was having a horrible headache by the time we got to the machine. The guy's still following us. No big deal. I'm sure he's got a house up here, I thought. I hadn't looked back for a while, and when I did, the guy was about 10 feet away from us. That's when I was able to get a good look at him before turning away. Black dress shirt, dark blue jeans, kind of a generic but unfriendly face, and his eyes were trained on Sarah. At this point, I got every shade of red alert going off in my head, but I have absolutely no clue what I would do should I have to intervene. I'm still holding my can of Coke in my hand, and that's about the only weapon I've got besides a knife in my backpack. So, I start to shake it pretty hard just in case. Should I have to use it then, it'll spray all over the guy's face and give us just enough time to hightail it back to the main road, where she wouldn't be in any danger. As I'm shaking the can, the guy advances closer and closer, and finally puts his hand on her shoulder. I flip the fuck out and point the can at the guy's face and open it in a matter of seconds, expecting it to shoot a stream of steady carbonated danger in the guy's face. Nope. Just kind of shot off a bit of foam and soda. The guy is stunned briefly, and that gives her enough time to escape his grip, and I don't know what I was thinking, but I just kind of swung the can in front of his face. About half of the can empties on the guy's face with open eyes. As he's doubling over in pain, which probably didn't last long, we hauled ass back to the main street and hurried back to the theater. Now, I have no clue what the guy's intentions were, but I'm just glad I was able to keep her out of danger. So I recently went on a trip with my family to Japan. Overall, I really enjoyed myself and thought it was a beautiful country. But one thing happened to me that kind of puts me off. I had recently got out of the hospital before we went on the trip. Recently meaning 2 days out of the hospital. I got my appendix removed and blood sucked out of my stomach. So as you can probably imagine, I was not in the best shape and very sore and incredibly fucking tired. My family had decided that they would go out and explore a temple, but I decided to stay back in the hotel because I was in too much pain and needed a rest. About 2-ish hours after my family had left, I decided I was hungry. Seeing a 7-Eleven out my hotel window, I decided to go and get something to eat because it wasn't too much of a walk and there was no room service or anything. So I set off on my small journey to get some food. After buying some kebab things and a strange cake, I went to the small seating area to sit and eat because I was too tired to walk back yet. It was just me and an older Japanese man sitting behind me. I felt someone touching my hair. I turned around. He started trying to tell me how beautiful my hair was, but his English was terrible, so I just smiled and said thank you. This was not uncommon, as I have strawberry blonde hair, and a lot of people in Japan seem to be fascinated with it. People always come up and touched it. I got back to eating. But soon after, the man moved next to me and started trying to talk to me again. To be completely honest, I sort of felt obliged to try and communicate because he seemed so cute and old and innocent. I just wanted to be nice. Bad idea. Shortly after, he decided to take a seat next to me. He starts saying short phrases in English. Incredibly sexual short phrases. His English seemed to have gotten better, and he continued to ask me for sex and tell me I was beautiful, and I was very uncomfortable at this point and got up and left the 7-Eleven. At this point, he decided it would be really cool and a fun idea to come outside with me. I was so tired and needed more pain medication, so at this point I just couldn't deal with his shit. I wanted to go back to the hotel and nap. I turned around and began cursing, telling him to leave me alone now. All of a sudden, he got this very angry look on his face and actually spat on me. I was so furious at this point that I turned around, ignored the pain in my stomach, and walked home so angrily I probably looked like a cartoon character. This is about something that happened to me when I was a baby, but my mom still counts it as one of the scariest events of her life. For a little backstory, both my parents were Marines stationed in Okinawa in the 80s. That's where they met, married, and where I was born. Once I was born, my mom opted for honorable discharge, but stayed in Okinawa with me as dependents. At the time, there was nothing available in base housing, so my parents had a small apartment out in town. Both of my parents still agreed that their time in Japan was the best of their lives and had many friends, both Marines and Japanese. And according to them, I was a very popular baby with their Japanese friends, with my blonde hair and blue eyes. One night when I was about 4 months old, my dad had to go for a training exercise, leaving my mom and I alone for a week or more. My mom had no problem with this, as they lived in a very safe neighborhood. So safe that they had once witnessed a 4-year-old child walking home alone from his grandmother's house at 3 a.m., and no one thought anything of it. Well, my dad had been gone for a few days, and one night my mom said that a strange noise woke her up. She said it wasn't very loud, but the core had kind of programmed her into being a very light sleeper. Thinking that I had woken up for a night feeding, she came to my room. When she came to my open door, she found a strange Japanese man reaching into my crib, trying to pick me up. Now here's where I think the story starts to take a slight turn to comical in retrospect. According to my dad, the weather in Japan was extremely hot and extremely humid, even in the middle of night. So my mom had the habit of sleeping naked to avoid overheating. So my mom is standing in her apartment, naked, watching a strange man trying to pick up her infant in the middle of the night. And bless that woman, her first reaction was to pick up my dad's aluminum baseball bat and chase the man from the apartment, screaming in English and what little Japanese she knew. She rechecked all the locks and spent the rest of the night sleeping on the floor next to my crib. The next day, feeling a little less shaken, she told one of her closest Japanese friends. The woman told her that she needed to be very careful and watch over me because blonde babies sell for a lot of money on the Japanese black market. After that, my mom insisted that my crib be moved back into my parents' room, and they continued to live in the same apartment without incident until a family emergency forced my mom to come back stateside. This story always makes me chuckle a little, just imagining my mother, stark naked and screaming like a banshee, chasing some guy with a bat, but it's a little chilling to think what might have happened to me if she hadn't been such a light sleeper. I'll never forget that night. It was last year, and I had just turned 25. I had been to a friend's wedding in another state and was returning by train. I reached the station around 5 a.m. It was freezing as the temperature had just hit 4 degrees. All I could think of was getting home fast, so I could sleep for hours after being tired from many nights. I generally avoid traveling home alone in the dark, but it was impossible to wait at the station until sunrise because 1 hour seemed like a very long time, so I decided to get a taxi. The distance from the station to my apartment is roughly 40 kilometers. There were 2 taxis, and I got into one of them without making any eye contact with the driver. I told him where I wanted to go, and we started. The man must have been in his late 50s or early 60s. Silver gray hair, big build. I decided to go with this taxi because I thought I'd be more safe with this fellow since he was elderly. And that was a mistake. Nearly 15 to 20 minutes had passed. I was looking at the road ahead. There were very few cars, and all I could see were trees that were close by and fog covered everywhere else. Suddenly I noticed that this guy had been staring at me from the rearview mirror, and he didn't blink or look away when I looked at him. It had been over 2 minutes, and he was still staring. He had scary, droopy eyes. I was very uncomfortable at this point, so I used my scarf to cover half my face, which was only covering my neck all the while. This didn't stop him, and he suddenly started laughing like a maniac. Then he said a word in some other language, so I asked him to repeat, and my heart was beating very fast. "So many people are dying," he said, and he started laughing again. I was too afraid to ask him any questions. I stood there frozen, regretting why I didn't wait at the station. My hands were shivering because I was trying to send a message to a friend, but my fingers just couldn't type properly. He turned around, now facing me, asked me if I was married. I managed to speak nervously, "No," and he said, "You will repent." With these words, he started to speed up. My mind was going crazy now. What the fuck did he mean by that? Why would he say such a thing to me? I tried looking around if it was a good idea to get off that taxi, but it was still very dark and there weren't many cars around. There was maybe 2 or 3 cars that would pass us every 5 to 10 minutes. But by this point I was pretty convinced that he was taking me to some other place. Maybe he wasn't, but I was still just too terrified to think straight. I was trembling with fear, and I was sure he was going to attack me or do something worse. Suddenly he slowed down, and he seemed to be talking to himself. "People die. You'll die. She'll die," pointing to the empty seat. With those words, he stopped the taxi right there and asked me to get down, saying, "We need fresh air, and the petrol is over." He wasn't drunk, but he had been hallucinating since he kept blabbering, looking at the empty seat, and was laughing for no reason. Arguing with him could make him annoyed, so I decided to do as he said until I got some help, or maybe I could stop him in some other way by agreeing to all his demands. I got out of the taxi, and so did he. Now he was right in front of me, but at a car-length distance, holding a lit torch, pointing it at his neck and repeating, "You will repent." I was almost crying due to fear, but running was impossible because I could have been run over by some car due to the fog, and my mind was not working properly by this point. The thought of calling someone didn't occur to me earlier, and now it was too risky since this maniac was standing right there holding that torch and moving his head like some possessed person. It felt like a scene from a horror movie, and his eyes appeared bigger than normal due to the torchlight that illuminated his creepy and now serious face. He said something again, which I didn't understand. I was sure he was going to kill me or torment me before that. I was extremely restless and looking around everywhere for help. To my relief, there was a car passing by and it stopped there looking at us just standing in the middle of the road. The random passerby came running to me and asked me to go towards his car where his daughter, who was nearly my age, opened the door. The insane cab driver ran back to his taxi and drove off in seconds. I was still breathing heavily and told them what had happened in the last 30 or 40 minutes. They told me I was going in the opposite direction of my destination, and it was not a safe area since many incidences had already occurred with girls in that area. I was right. That driver was taking me to some other place. They had sensed something was wrong by the way that maniac stood there holding the torch and the way the light shone my silhouette more clearly, so they decided to check what was going on. Had they not stopped, I wouldn't be alive to tell this incident. Since that night, I never travel alone again at night. I'm thankful that those people who saved my life stopped, and sometimes we see many people who say they need help, but we fear it could be a trap and we don't stop. Had they thought the same thing, I'd be dead.
Me and my sisters, of which I have 3, grew up in a smallish country town in rural Australia. As you could probably imagine, there was not a lot going on there, and one by one, we jumped ship and moved to greener pastures. In this instance, bigger, more exciting cities. This story is not mine, it is my youngest sister's. When it came time for her to follow suit and move out, she followed the rest of us to Sydney. At the time this story takes place, she was 19 years old. At her first work Christmas party, not long after she'd arrived in town, she got slightly intoxicated and, not knowing the city very well, opted to pay for a taxi in order to get home safely. She left the party, flagged one down, jumped in the front seat next to the driver, advised her destination, and began making polite conversation. As she tells it, the driver was fine at first, but before too long he began turning the conversation to her looks and her job, telling her that she was gorgeous and asking if she did any modeling. She laughed it off and told him no. It was at this point that, while driving the taxi, he reached underneath her seat, pulled out a camera, and started taking her photo. His compliments grew increasingly cruder, and she asked him repeatedly to stop taking her picture before getting angry and yelling at him to stop the taxi and let her out, which he would not do. Thinking quickly, she looked ahead to see if there were any red lights coming up or he would have to stop the car. Luckily, there was one fast approaching. The driver slowed down gradually rather than driving to the light and stopping, all the while continuing to take her photo. When he was finally moving slow enough that she felt she could exit the car without injuring herself, she opened the door and jumped out. He was moving slowly enough at this point that, thankfully, she was not injured. Drunk, scared, and lost, she sat in the gutter briefly to collect herself before finally coming to the realization that, as she had no clue where she was, she would have to get in another taxi in order to get home. Reluctantly, she flagged down another car, this time getting in the back seat and once again advising her destination. The driver of the second car saw that she had been crying and was visibly shaken up, and asked her what had happened and if she was all right. She explained the events. The driver paused for a moment before informing her that the first driver had been taking her in the complete opposite direction of where she had told him she needed to go. Attempts were made to find out who this guy was and report him. However, as my sister was drunk and new to the city, she was not able to provide enough specific information, i.e. location, exact time, taxi company, description of driver, etc. Since this incident, whenever she has no other option but to get a taxi home, the first thing she does after getting in the car is take a photo of the driver's license with her phone. It makes my skin crawl to think that the guy who did this is more than likely still driving taxis in Sydney, and that this is heralded as being the safest way to get home if you're a young woman and it's late at night.
I work at a bar in a suburb of Melbourne that is safe during the day, but has become sort of notorious for a high rate of rapes and abductions during the nighttime, specifically along this main street that my work is on. I often work night shifts or late shifts. Tonight I even finished at 11. For some context, I am a petite 19-year-old girl. I got out of work at 11 and started to walk down the street, which is quite well lit in some parts, but quite dark in others, and began looking to hail a taxi. I was having no luck finding one, and in fact there were very few cars about, which was unusual. I looked across the road and saw a dude with a hoodie on that was concealing most of his face. He looked young, maybe early to mid-20s, and high on something. He seemed quite shady to me, and I noted he was pretty tall but thin, and I guess I looked at him for too long, because then he crossed the street towards me. I stopped looking at him and started walking sort of fast down the street, looking behind me to keep my eye on his distance and to now more desperately get in a taxi. I turned around to look at him, and to my relief he was walking into a side street. I stepped onto the street trying to get a better view down the road when he came back around from the side street. My stomach dropped as I saw he was now with two more guys. I started to walk really fast now, and they began to walk after me. I was walking as fast as I could without jogging. I was getting really panicked and was thinking of hailing down any car to ask someone for help. The three men were getting closer, and they were shouting at me, but my anxiety sunk in and I didn't hear what they said. It was only white noise. A taxi with its lights off drove past, and I ran out into the middle of the road. The driver said he was finished for the day and wasn't taking any more customers. I told him I was being followed and asked if I could sit in his car for a second to feel safe. He let me in the taxi and drove 20 meters away and told me to get out. The men were all still there. I begged him to take me out of sight a little further down the road. He noticed how scared I was then and had got concerned and fatherly. The taxi driver was extremely lovely and refused to let me get out of his car until he found me another taxi to take me home. He drove around with me for a few minutes until we found one. He beeped the other cab down and explained the situation to him. I thanked him profusely and we swapped cars. The next driver was also incredibly nice. He said he had a young daughter and got quite upset and angry thinking about how people can take away your right to feel safe. I had felt like I was in real danger, and I'm so thankful they were there and it helped me out.
This incident happened not all that long ago. I'm a 19-year-old female and obviously enjoy the night out with my friends. This particular night, a girlfriend and I had headed down to our local club/pub. We were dancing, drinking, and having a great time when I noticed it was about 2 a.m. coming up to the closing time, around 3 a.m., and we should probably think about heading off soon, as if we waited until it had closed, the wait for a taxi would be quite long as everyone is looking for one. So I let my friend know my plans, and she insists she wanted to stay, and she then walked me out the front while I waited for a taxi. As we get to the top of the stairs, she sees me off at the door and goes back inside. I say goodbye to the bouncers, as I said it's our local, and start walking over to the next taxi in the line. As I start approaching the taxi, I hear my friend call me from behind. She still has my bank cards and money, luckily. I walk back to the door to get them off her and then say goodbye again. This time, as I turn to leave, the bouncer says to me, "You may want to take the second taxi in the line." Upon me questioning him, he doesn't seem to have a reason behind his advice and just insists I trust him. I'm from Australia, and taxis usually wait in lines, and you have to take the next taxi in line as part of fairness. I explained to the bouncer not only will taxi driver number 1 not be happy, but taxi number 2 may not take my fare for no valid reason. Annoying, I know. Me, being 19 and naive, think to myself, I only live around the corner, I have my phone, what's the worst that could happen, right? Wrong. I took the first taxi in line, and there were no immediate alarm bells. He didn't seem different than any other taxi driver, not exactly polite nor rude, just a taxi driver. We are a few minutes into the fare, driving along the coastlines to my suburb when, all of a sudden, he pulls the taxi over to the side of the road and starts walking around to my door. At this point, I'm so confused as to what is going on. First thought maybe there's a flat tire, until he opens my door. I asked him what he's doing, and he replies, "We're going to the beach." Alarm bells and red flags went off left, right, and center. I grabbed my phone and dialed 000 right away and told him I was calling the police. He started to panic and told me not to be silly, and he just wanted some quality time. He reached for my arm to try and get me out of the car. I pushed him away, closed the door, and waited to be connected. I read a lot about people who are polite to creepers in these situations, but I was anything but. At this point, I was connected with someone from emergency who asked what my emergency was, and I said I needed assistance and gave her my address. She then proceeded to tell me I needed to call the police assistance line if it wasn't an emergency. I responded with, "Well, it's about to be if you don't get someone down here." She assured a car was on the way and to get out of the car. We were only a minute or two down the road from where we departed, and usually there are 3 or 4 squad cars there preparing for the end of the night antics. I knew I would have assistance in no time. While all this was happening, he was walking back to his driver's side and attempting to get back in. I don't know if he would have driven away with me in the car, kicked me out or what, but I got out and he sped off. I kicked myself for not getting his taxi ID, which is something I usually do. I kicked myself even more for not listening to the bouncer who, I see now, obviously had a good reason for me to not get in this car. I rang my friend and asked her to stay on the phone with me. I just told her I was still outside waiting for the taxi and got bored. She offered to come and wait, but I insisted I was fine. Once the police came, they took me home and asked what had happened. They took a statement from me, but there wasn't much they could do as I didn't get a license plate or taxi ID. The most I could provide was his appearance and taxi company. I didn't tell anyone about this situation except for my then friend, now boyfriend, who was a little shaken up by this. I hate thinking about what could have happened that night, and how lucky I am that it didn't. About 2 months on, my boyfriend, his housemate, and my sister arranged a cab to pick us up from my boyfriend's place and take us to the same venue this all happened at. And who was the driver? Yep, same guy. I didn't say anything at the time to anyone because I knew that wouldn't have turned out well, but this time I got his ID and plate number and reported it to the police the next day. Apparently, this wasn't the first complaint they've had against this particular driver, but it was the furthest he had gone. Most of the other complaints were creepy remarks, etc. From what I know, the police made contact with the taxi company and informed them of the situation, and I don't know the outcome from then. I have definitely learned my lesson from this.
I'm a 17-year-old female from the UK, and this took place a few months ago at my grandfather's funeral, or at least the after-party to it. Me, my cousin, and her best friend were drinking, because that's what you do at a wake or whatever. I was 16 at the time, and I needed to go home at 1 in the morning, and I was completely shit-faced, so I called a taxi. I wasn't ready to walk home in the state that I was in. After 10 minutes, the taxi arrived. I quickly finished my drink, said goodbye to everyone there, and got in the taxi waiting outside. The taxi driver was a pretty ordinary-looking Pakistani or Indian guy with dark hair and glasses. I paid to go home, which cost something along the lines of £40.50. And I never said a word to him besides my destination. On the way, he asked a bunch of questions, like my age, why I was out drinking so late, and why I'm going home alone. I told him I was 18. I don't know why I did, and maybe I wanted to feel older or something. I said that I was back from a funeral and wanted to dull the pain. I didn't answer the last question. He asked me if anyone was at home to open the door for me or to see me to bed safely, me thinking this dude was just a good Samaritan wanting to know I was safe. I just said that everyone at home was likely asleep, but it didn't really matter because I was often a rebel and came in late and they knew that. In retrospect, I probably should have just said there was someone at home waiting for me to return. Around halfway through the journey home, the driver drove past a turn he was meant to be taking. I told him, and he just said this way was much quicker, and he didn't want to waste my time. Wrong turn after wrong turn, and he used the same excuse every time. This way is much quicker, and don't worry about it. He went down an alley near a closed-down theater and a car dealership, which was also shut down. I told him he must be confused because this is not near my house. The car stopped slowly, and I became confused. I asked what was wrong, and he put his arm around me. He told me that he couldn't focus on the road because of how distracting I was. He then leaned into a kiss, but I blocked him off with my hand and asked what he was doing. Maybe I gave him some mixed signals, I don't know. Keeping one hand on my shoulder, he grabbed my leg. This is when I started getting serious creeper vibes. He then unzipped his trousers and presented himself to me. I went from thinking he was just a regular guy who's been receiving mixed signals to a full-blown rapist in seconds. He began to feel me up, my chest and thighs. I honestly had no idea what to do at this point. Should I do what he wants, or should I try to escape? But if I don't, he'll probably kill me. I made a snap judgment and went along with it. I pretended it was totally fine, and what he was doing wasn't rape, and that I wasn't underage. I started to feel him up too, and I kissed him a few times. And luckily, before it could get anywhere else, he got a call. He told me that he needed to answer it and that we had to do this some other time. I said okay, and he dropped me off at home. I haven't told anyone and don't plan on doing so, and haven't called a single taxi since. I'm just glad it didn't go anywhere, because if it did, I could have been raped or killed. Whoever was on the other side of that phone call, I owe you my life. I called the police anonymously the next morning and gave them a description. No arrest has been made yet.
My husband and I were stopping over in New York before heading to our temporary home of Poland. We had been living there for about a year and are originally from Australia. We'd spent the past year traveling throughout some of the more shady parts of Europe, so we thought we were generally prepared for any weird incidents. We were tired as we walked through JFK, ignoring everyone who wanted us to take their special taxi. We went outside and waited in the line with all the other irritated travelers. When it was our turn, the taxi driver got out and left. Another guy came and took our bags. The motor was still running. I didn't really think anything of it and didn't really care at that point. However, I insisted I take my own bag and tried to open the trunk. "No!" He snapped at me. I was startled and said it was okay, I'll just sit with it on my lap. My husband and I traveled light, so we only had one suitcase between us. "Can you open the trunk?" my husband asked the guy. "Otherwise, there's no room for us." The guy already looked pissed, and all we were asking him to do was his job. I was already looking around for another cab because I couldn't be bothered. "Fine," the guy snapped and basically ripped the trunk open. I hadn't gotten into the car yet. It was kind of a paranoid thing that I never get into a taxi alone as a result of some kidnapping stories in Greece of a similar nature, so I waited. And I saw what was in the trunk. It wasn't all over the flooring, just on one side. I instantly felt ill. It looked a lot like blood. The spot was wet and I stared blankly. With the dim light, I could just make out various other stains of similar but darker colors. I had barely begun to process it all before the suitcase was in and the trunk door was slammed. I was now wide awake and did not want to get in that taxi. Everything was wrong and this was a mistake. "What's the holdup? Get in!" The taxi stand dude yelled at us, as equally pissed off passengers behind were eagerly awaiting their ride. I tried to get my husband's attention, but he was already in the back seat. If this were a horror movie and I was watching, I'd be screaming at myself, "Don't get in the cab!" So I got in the taxi with my bag on my lap. I clutched it as we spun around corners, went forward sharply, and had brakes slamming. I felt sick and couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. Was it real? Halfway through my haze, I realized this was not the way. I mean, far be it for me to tell taxi drivers in their own city where the hell they're going, but I like to be prepared and I like to know where I am. And we were not taking the tourist scenic route where they charge you a lot of dough. This guy was just going the wrong way. "You're going the wrong way." The words fell out of my mouth. The guy said nothing. He didn't flinch, didn't move. "What?" my husband asked me. "We are going the wrong way," I shouted. "Are we going the wrong way?" my husband asked. "We are going the wrong way!" I shouted again. My husband, not one to take shit from anyone, said, "Hey, man, don't think you can screw with us. We're not paying you more than we agreed upon, so stop fucking around and take us where we're going or we're going to call the cops." He had no idea why I was freaking out. I didn't care about the money. I just thought we were a pawn in this guy's master plan. We were going to swim with the fishes in the Hudson or something because I was going crazy and my mind was wandering. There was blood in the trunk. This guy's going to kill us with his driving, although he had nothing on Romanian taxi drivers, and maybe planning on it for later or in some warehouse with all of his serial killer cab driver friends. The driver immediately slammed on the brakes at a set of lights. I'm pretty sure this taxi we're in is not a taxi, I muttered to myself, but then the cab driver spoke up. Do you see this sign? This is a motherfucking taxi, he snapped. Then do your motherfucking job, my husband snapped at him without a second thought. Perhaps the guy thought this was too much trouble, one loudmouth Aussie, Bogan, and his crazy wife, because now we turned around and we were going the right way. We get to the hotel and I made sure to check the trunk again, but it was darker now and I couldn't see anything clearly, except for lots of shredded rags with a deep rust color, staining them all.
My boyfriend and I took a trip to the Oklahoma Zoo last month and had a blast learning about all the animals. Nearing the end of our zoo visit, it was close to closing time and had begun to rain just a little. We were at the back of the zoo on the Ozark Trail exhibit, which is a half-mile long trail that winds through and over natural Oklahoman habitats such as forests, plains, swamps, and even man-made structures like barns and sheds. We were kind of rushing through because it was getting late, and even though it was drizzling, it was hot and humid and taking its toll on us. Besides a couple of stragglers, the huge exhibit was mostly empty. We approached the halfway point, a part of the trail that led into a barn to showcase nocturnal local fauna, and my boyfriend said he was about to pee himself and couldn't hold it anymore. There were benches in this area, so I said I'd wait while he backtracked to find a bathroom. He ran off, and I figured I'd check out the barn while I waited, assuming it might be cooler in there. The barn was dark. It housed owls, raccoons, a huge bat tank in the middle, and some various other animals along the shelves. The only light source was a dim black light in the bat tank and some low heat lamps for the owls and some lizards. It was also extremely humid and stuffy, so I passed over the animal shelves quickly and stopped for a sec to admire the bats. It was a floor-to-ceiling glass tank, and it was kind of hard to see, so I cupped my hands around my eyes and kind of leaned into it. As I was doing this, I felt someone press into me from behind and squish me against the tank. I thought it was my boyfriend at first, but I smelled pretty strong BO and knew it wasn't him. He wears deodorant and definitely put it on this day. I thought it was some kind of joke and waited for the person to leave, or like maybe they were just being pushy trying to see the bats better. I felt him breathing hard, and he kept pushing harder and harder against me. I was panicking, but in denial at the same time. Like, why would this guy be doing this? I tried getting away from him, but he wouldn't budge. I could feel his hands groping my sides and hips, and I was actually embarrassed that he was grabbing and pinching the roll of fat above the waist of my pants. I remember how awful he smelled, and how loud his breathing was, even though the bats were squeaking and making a ton of noise. The cell phone in my back pocket vibrated really loudly, and he jumped, and when it started ringing, he finally let go and took off. I didn't see which exit he left out of, or even what he looked like because I was too stunned to turn away from the bats. I felt shocked and humiliated and scared and sexually violated for the first time in my life. I wanted to leave the barn, but I was scared that if I moved, he'd come back. I wasn't sure if he was still there or not. The phone rang again, and I saw it was my boyfriend who was calling. I answered it and he said he couldn't find me, I told him where I was, and he walked in a couple seconds later. With my boyfriend there, I felt safe again and saw that the guy was nowhere in the barn. I'm sure he was long gone. I wanted to ask my boyfriend if he'd seen anyone leaving the barn, but I knew I'd have to explain it to him, and the idea made me feel physically ill. I thought about telling zoo staff before we left, but again, I'd have to relive the story, and I didn't think they'd be able to do much with my description. It didn't occur to me at the time that they might have had cameras in the barn. I did eventually speak over the phone with park security a couple of days after and leave an anonymous tip about the barn. They wanted me to make a report with the police, but I declined. I feel better about it now and thought I'd say something to you all. I haven't told my boyfriend or anyone but the zoo security, and I don't think I will anytime soon. It's a lot easier to talk about it when it's anonymous. Even though there was no chance of me anticipating an attack in a barn exhibit at the zoo, many insecure young people might feel invincible, like I did, when it comes to sexual attacks. Please always be vigilant and careful, especially when you're in a dangerous situation. There is no telling whether or not you'll be a target, no matter what you look like.
I was really curious about any creepy encounters I might have had when I was little. I asked my mom, and she starts explaining this situation to me. I was 5 or 6 when this happened at a local zoo in a small town in Ohio. We were around the big cat exhibits, and I was in love with the cheetahs at the time. And one of the exhibits had about 2 or 3 ocelots that liked going near the fencing around their enclosure. There was a tall wooden fence about my height, and then heavy-duty wire around the enclosure. But then there were holes big enough that I could surprisingly stick my chubby kid hand in. I remember thinking that the ocelots were just baby cheetahs, and I was trying to pet one of them. We started walking around the rest of the zoo. I got cotton candy stuck in my hair and almost pissed myself when we went into the aquarium because I was terrified of sharks, etc. Basically, we were having an awesome time, and Kid Me was excited about all the animals around. That was until my mom says that she noticed a woman watching us intently. We wound up heading back to the big cat area because I wouldn't shut up about the ocelots. Mom says she got slightly nervous when we were walking back because she thought that the woman had been following us around. Mom had a stress-related mental illness, and I guess she got a little paranoid. But in this case, it was a good thing. This woman comes up to me as I'm watching the ocelots, and I remember thinking that she looked like a movie star because she had blonde hair and bright red lipstick. She says something like, "Come with me, honey. We'll go look for a zookeeper and see about letting you pet those kitties." So I nearly shat my pants at the opportunity. I ignored my stranger danger lessons and took her hand. As I'm walking, I remember getting this feeling that I'm going to disappoint the hell out of my mother because I know going off with a stranger is bad. But ocelots, man. I'm just beginning to get led away when I hear my mom shout. I turn around, and this is where things get hazy. I remember seeing my intimidating, frizzy red-haired giant Amazon of a mother barreling towards me and the blonde lady through a crowd. Mom scoops me up and I wave goodbye to the woman as she stumbles away looking pissed off. And that's where the memory fades out. Mom says she had to physically wrench me from the woman because she kept yelling, "This lady is trying to take my baby." I started crying when the woman tried to lead me away again, and apparently I shouted that she wasn't my mother. Looking back on this, I just feel really emotional about it, and I thank my mother profusely like an ass, because I now realize what a close call it had been.
I'm a young woman, just turned legal adult in my country. I'm pansexual and I have a girlfriend. I'll call her Cassie in this story. I'll tell you now that I have ASD and SPD, which is sensory processing disorder. Loud crowds and sounds can easily disorient me and cause me to have a meltdown where I am unable to talk properly or at all. It's not that I'm a socially anxious person or that I'm non-confrontational. I'm exactly the opposite, but my neurological disorder comes into play. Cassie and I, for our 1-year anniversary date, decided to go camping for a long weekend. We ended up straying outside of the capital's limits, and we decided to go to the zoo the next day, and I, having an almost childish love of animals, was eager to go and see everything. The day arrives, and it's a very hot and clear day, so we both dress in tank tops and shorts to keep cool. When we first got there, we slathered on sunscreen on each other to keep ourselves from getting Irish tans, and then in our giddiness shared a short kiss. Right off the bat after pulling away, I noticed this guy watching us from behind Cassie. He was balding, a little taller than Cassie, who was 5'2", but shorter than me since I'm 5'5". He was portly, with a Charlie Chaplin mustache and a pair of sunglasses on. I guess for some people still, seeing a pair of girls together who aren't sisters or best friends, it's weird, but this guy automatically made me feel nervous. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, and we bought our tickets and went into the zoo together. I thought that the guy watching us wouldn't be there, but nope. At every exhibit we went to, every time we stopped to look at an animal, he was there, or next to us, staring at us. Cassie is a pretty observant person, so she noticed and tried to take loops to avoid him, but he just kept popping up. Eventually, though, he didn't show up alongside of us, so we thought he was done being creepy. Around this time, I didn't put in my foam earplugs, a way to keep me in loud, noisy places a little while longer, and so everything was starting to get to me. By the time we got to a cafe that's there, I wasn't able to speak hardly at all, so I went nonverbal. Cassie had to use the restroom, and since it was quiet in there, she figured it was best to leave me alone. I was sitting at a table, nursing a chocolate milk and some poutine, when, yup, creepy guy walks over. Before I can protest, he sits right down across from me at the table and starts talking. "So, what's your name, pretty girl?" I didn't answer, just stared at him. "Come on, don't be shy. What's your name? Was that girl your girlfriend? Are you a lesbian?" Those questions he kept repeating, and I was struggling to verbalize a strong go away to him, but all I could do was squeak. Yeah, not very threatening. So, he keeps going, the questions getting a little more sexually aggressive. "You ever been penetrated? Ever use a really big dildo on yourself or your girlfriend?" He even asked me if I'd ever had a threesome with my girlfriend. Finally, I had it when he touched my cheek and smirked. I literally stabbed his hand with a plastic fork I grabbed from the poutine. When he hollered, I smacked him. Like I said, I'm a confrontational person, and I stormed into the bathroom. I used an app on my phone to alert Cassie of the situation, and we both agreed to tell the staff. Creepy guy was still at our table when we returned, and he gave us a look. I couldn't tell with the sunglasses, but I knew he was stripping me and my girlfriend. We told a worker what was going on, who immediately alerted the zoo security. Creepy guy got up and was about to leave when he was apprehended and started telling the guard that I was the one who harassed him. Big mistake. Angrily, I typed out a message explaining everything, to which Cassie confirmed, both of us ready to crucify this pig for even trying to pull that after what he did. Luckily, the guy believed us and had the guy escorted to his car. In apology, we got free behind-the-scenes passes and got to check out some really cool stuff, so that was fun. But later that day when we were leaving, the security guard pulled us aside and gave us his number. Apparently, while he was yanking the guy out, he said something that made this guy sick. He told him he just wanted to have a threesome with us, and one way or another he was going to penetrate a couple of lesbians. Word for word, that is what he said. It stuck in my mind and I can't get it out. He gave us his number because he didn't want this creep attacking us and getting away with it. If we needed him to act as an additional witness or the like on our behalf, he would be glad to. To the security guard, I want to thank you so much for going up and above the call of duty. Luckily, this guy never harassed us again, and I hadn't seen him since the zoo. This happened a while ago, so I apologize if some things do not seem clear. I've removed this experience from my memory for an obvious reason, but have now decided to tell people about what happened as I realized it's something I shouldn't hide. Me and my brother Ron were in my room watching the NFL, screaming at the screen when our team would do something idiotic. We were 40 minutes into the game. The cornerbacks were messing around, and out of frustration, Ron slammed his fist into the remote, turning off the television by accident. I said, "What the fuck?" and turned the TV back on. As the screen loaded back up, we heard fast-paced footsteps downstairs. Ron and I quickly turned our heads to the bedroom door. I turned down the volume to hear the noises clearer. I think someone's inside," Ron said. I could hear the stutter in his voice. He was anxious. "No, it's probably just the dog," I sighed. Ron, however, was a lot more cautious. He walked over to the door and locked it. The click it made obviously alerted the intruder. At the time, though, I brushed it off as my Jack Russell Terrier. We heard even more footsteps. Ron whispered, "That's not a dog." Ron, being nervous, put me on edge, so I agreed with him and turned off the bedroom lights. Ron ran around the room trying to find some sort of object that we could use as a weapon. I sat next to the door with my ear placed on our wall. They were thin, so if there was anyone inside the house, I would hear it. Nothing happened. It was just dead silence with our heavy breathing. "Take a look," Ron said. He had his phone turned on just in case we needed to phone 911. I lay on my chest and looked through the gap under the bedroom door. I saw blackness, but I could see faded boots down the upstairs hall. I felt my hands shaking as I pushed myself back up to my feet. I tiptoed to Ron, who was waiting anxiously for the answer. "Someone's here," I whispered as low as I could. Ron's face went pale as he stared into nothingness. At one point, I thought he was going to black out on me. I pulled Ron over to our window. I quietly opened the window and looked down at the grass, 2 stories below my current position. Ron was still in a different world, as if he blocked himself from reality, leaving the responsibility to me. I tried not to pay much attention to him and instead focused on escaping. I took Ron's phone out of his hand as he crouched on the carpet. He had installed one of those applications where specific fingerprints can enter the phone. I took his hand, which was shockingly freezing, and held his pointing finger on the screen. I jumped out of my skin when the phone let out a loud beep, and all of a sudden, I could hear footsteps running straight to the bedroom. I quickly typed in 911 and put one leg out of the window. I heard thumps on my bedroom door and shouting. He was shouting, "I'm going to kill you." I landed on the porch roof and shouted at Ron to snap him back into action. Ron stood up quickly and stumbled outside of the window. He landed on the roof beside me as I forced the window shut again. "We need to jump," I said. I could hear faint thumping behind the walls. He was struggling to get inside our room. I jumped off the porch roof and sprained my ankle. Ron was wobbling on the edge of the roof. "Quick," I said. I avoided shouting as whoever the intruder was would have known we were outside. Ron touched his chest, head, right shoulder and left shoulder, making the cross, and jumped. He rolled when he landed on the floor and rubbed his neck as we ran blocks. We had run a good 6 blocks until I realized I had left the dog behind and heard a faint voice in my jean pocket. I pulled out the phone to hear a woman asking if I was still there. I told her that we needed cops immediately. She told us to stay on the line, and cops were en route to the house. I burst into tears from fears of what just happened and worrying if my dog was hurt. I talked to the operator as both me and Ron slowly walked back to the house. We heard the siren and felt weight lifted off of our shoulders. I sat in my chair on the porch, with Ron in a squat position beside me, both of us waiting to come face to face with the intruder. 4 cops came out. There was no man, but one of them was holding Lewis. Lewis was my dog. I stood up and held Lewis, kissing his head and patting his back. I sat back down in the chair and placed him on my lap, still hugging him and apologizing for leaving him behind. The cops explained that there was nobody inside, and there was nothing stolen either. In fact, they explained there was nothing there that would have proven someone invaded our property. And they never found him, but I can assure you I haven't had one good night's sleep since. Every night I lock my door and keep my dog with me in my room. Ron installed some CCTV cameras in both of our houses. We both agreed to never speak about it again. When my dad was 16, he lived in a small farmhouse in the middle of a rural forest area somewhere on the west side of Washington State. It was late at night, and he was watching TV in his basement when he heard the animals in the pens outside begin to whine and make frightened noises. My dad went up to the first floor and looked out the window. He didn't see anything abnormal, just the animals, frightened. He figured it was the rain because of the past few hours it had been coming down pretty hard. As he was about to turn away, however, he saw something that made him freeze. A man had popped up from a crouching position among the sheep and was now staring directly at my dad. They both met eyes for a few seconds before the man darted off in the surrounding forest. My father was filled with fear and worry. He wanted to wake his parents, but they probably wouldn't believe him and tell him to go to sleep because he was imagining things. My dad went back to his TV show in the basement, but not long after, he heard scratching on the outside of the first floor walls. At first he let it go and assumed it was a mouse or small animal, but it wouldn't cease, and he began to get worried. There was more scratching and even more tapping, but then suddenly he heard the shattering of glass breaking. My dad's eyes widened, and he rushed to the closet and took out the family's 12-gauge shotgun. The person had smashed the outside door handle off and reached in through the broken window to unlock the deadbolt. My dad hid in the closet and called 911 with the basement door locked. The TV was off, and he whispered to the operator that someone had broken into his home and he was hiding in his closet with a gun. The operator told him to shoot if the guy attacked and that the cops were on their way. My dad could hear things being knocked over, drawers being opened and slammed shut, cabinets being opened and closed, and doors being opened and slammed. He heard the stairboards creak and stuff being rummaged through on the second floor. A few minutes later, while the guy was still upstairs, officers suddenly stormed the house through the open back door. They were shouting, telling the guy to get on the ground. My dad opened the closet door and made his way out of the basement and into the kitchen. The officers came back down with the man in cuffs. They asked my dad questions about what had happened, if he was hurt, and other stuff the police would need to know. A few glass plates and cups were the only things broken, and besides that, the house was only in mild disarray. My father was tearfully embraced by my grandparents, as they had feared the worst. From that point on, renovations were completed to remove all windows near the entrance to the home. To give you some background, I'm generally not easily scared. I like to stretch my mind and see how far I can go. Zombie nightmares? No problem. Scary movies? I've watched them all. I did notice, however, that there's one thing that keeps repeating in my dreams. I'm terrified of home invasions. If I ever dream about someone uninvited in my house, I freeze. Can't move, can't scream, can't run. So I've been doing some thinking as to why that may be, and I figured out why. As a child, I lived in a fairly well-off town in Israel, right on the edge of it, that was separated from a not-so-well-off city by a large field. When I was about 5 or 6, I would sleep in my room with the door open so that I could see into my parents' room across the hall, since it made me feel safer. There would be this thing, though. I would wake up in the middle of the night for no particular reason and just stare at the doorway. Then after a few seconds, I would see a silhouette of a person passing by, sometimes pausing at the doorway for a brief second before continuing. It scared the shit out of me, and I would force myself to cry so that my parents would come and check on me. They never found anything and attributed it to bad dreams. This probably happened 4 to 5 times. About a year later, my parents woke up one day to find the drawers in my dad's desk completely out and empty. My dad asked my mom whether she messed around with them. Clearly she didn't. We installed an alarm system. Honestly, with the alarm system, it was worse. One night I woke up, again for no apparent reason, and a second later, this piercing tone rang through the house and wouldn't stop. I freaked out, jumped out of my bed, and looked towards my parents' room. Just then I see a silhouette of a person sprinting across my doorway, down the hallway. By the time my parents got out of their bed, the person was already out of the house, leaving the large door to the house wide open. This happened 3 fucking times. We started getting preemptive. We got one of those motion sensors that play a recorded message when activated. My mom recorded, "Get out of here, you fucking thief," type message, and put it next to the main door of the house. One night I wake up, again for no apparent reason, although I think I know why by now. And 2 seconds later I hear my mom's recorded message cursing at the thief. A few seconds later I hear footsteps of someone running away. At least it worked. And that was the last time that happened. When I was 13, we moved to another country, but would always go back in the summer to visit our extended family and typically stayed at my grandma's. One of my favorite things to do is to stay up late at my grandma's house in Tel Aviv, in the living room, and watch National Geographic after everyone went to sleep. I don't know why, I just found it very relaxing. I was about 14, watching National Geographic at 2 a.m., and I get that fucking feeling. The one that made me wake up when I was little for no apparent reason, except I was awake. I concluded that it was probably nothing, but just in case, I put both of my hands up and middle fingered the whole room slowly. I figured if anyone was watching me, they would have gone away after seeing that. Yeah, right. So at around 3 a.m., I decided to go up to my bed on the second floor. But on my way there, I noticed my mom's bag is on the table. I considered moving it somewhere further away from the window, in case someone wanted to grab it with a broomstick or something. I decide not to, because it's probably not gonna happen, and what if she woke up, couldn't find it, freaked out and called the police? So I'm in my bed, reading a book about ghosts, as I was pretty spiritual at 14 and really wanted to believe. I say in my mind, okay, if you guys are real, give me a sign. The light flickers a little. That could be anything. I'm going to need a bigger sign. At that moment, I hear a huge boom from downstairs. I come out of my room at the same time my mom comes out of her room and my grandma comes out of hers. They ask me why I'm making so much noise. I tell them that I'm not, and that I think there's somebody downstairs. My mom tells me, nonsense, it must just be... Boom. My mom begins to freak out and starts screaming things like, "Get out of here, you thief," deja vu, and just in general screaming in the direction of the first floor. After a few minutes, she goes down, and with all the irony in the world, the window is broken, and the bag on the table is gone. This happened in the mid-90s. I attended a Catholic school as a child, as did my friend Taylor, and we were always given the Monday after Easter off of school. As every weekend, I had opted to spend the night at Taylor's house, this time on Sunday night since we didn't have school the next day. We were 9 years old and in the 4th grade, and we lived in a town that literally this past year was rated the 5th safest town in our state. Our parents had no problems with us being home alone on a Monday. Taylor lived on what I would call an in-town farm, being it was a farm with horses and fields and whatnot, but was right on the edge of town, about a 2-mile drive from the center of our small town. Taylor and I were sleeping in her upstairs bedroom when we were both awakened at about 7:30 a.m. by what was the unmistakable sound of someone kicking in a door downstairs. Her tiny terrier dog Chance ran down and was barking like crazy, and then the banging stopped, and we heard Chance yelp loudly from being kicked or hit. At this point, we were terrified and silent, and Taylor finally whispered if we should call her mom, and I urged her to call 911. While she described to the operator what was happening, we could hear the person walking around downstairs, back and forth, I assume carrying things out of the house. The operator had us quietly get out of the bed, and we went into the closet. I remember sitting there with her on the floor and just praying the police would get there soon. I also remember thinking maybe we should climb out onto the roof of the farmhouse like we often did through her window. The level of fear in my body was something I will never forget and is indescribable. Luckily, in what felt like an eternity, but turned out was less than 5 minutes later, we heard the police pulling up and the cops screaming at someone. After several more minutes, the operator told us it was okay to go downstairs. I'm not sure what loss of communication there was, but when we walked down the stairs and around the corner into the kitchen, 5 cops stood there with their weapons pointed at us. When they saw it was us, they took us into the living room and calmed us down and started with all the questions. In the end, it ended up being one of the laborers who worked for the pool company who was installing a pool who robbed the home. That is how he knew what time Taylor and her family were normally gone from the home. According to the police, he was very remorseful when they told him there were children in the home. I really wish he knew that my entire life I have still lived in fear of home invaders, and when I am home alone with my children now, if my husband is out of town for work, I lay awake or freak out at the slightest sounds. We have also installed a security system for my ease of mind. While writing this entry, I thought to myself to check the court records about the man whose name is still tattooed in my memory. Turns out since that home invasion, he has a laundry list of other charges as recently as 2013 for burglary, assault, battery, and meth. This doesn't help me feel any better about what could have happened to Taylor and myself had he found us there, alone. So I work at a pizza place, usually inside as my insurance does not cover claims when driving for business, but occasionally I will cover a delivery shift for one of the drivers because the money is good. Our delivery area includes a few new development upper middle class cookie cutter neighborhoods, bad tips, an older 1940s era village, average tips, 2 apartment complexes, great tips, some trailer parks, great tips or no tips, and a bunch of rural areas, usually good tips. Not rural to the point of seeing hundreds of stars at night, but enough that you couldn't hear your neighbors yell. So about a week ago, I was covering a delivery shift. I come back to the shop feeling pretty good. I'm averaging $5 a delivery, and they've been all pretty good and pretty close, and I check to see if I have any more deliveries. I have one to an address I have never seen before, and it's out on one of those more rural roads. I asked the kid who took the order what was up, because there were special instructions on the ticket. He says, "They said go around back, because the front door is not operational." I'm like, okay, that's not that uncommon. People often want you to go around back. Either they painted the door, the house shifted and it's a bitch to open, or they're just hanging out back. So as I'm driving out to the house, I get an odd feeling. I don't really like the idea of going to the back of some house out in the sticks. It would be all too easy for some thugs to order a pizza to an abandoned house. There are quite a few in the more rural areas, then jump the delivery guy. I figured I'll just scope the place out when I get there, and if it seems sketchy, just call them and make up some bull about how it's against company policy to go around the back of houses to prevent robberies. As I'm driving around the house, I realize it's towards the end of this road that gets less populated the further down you go. Great. I'm pretty near the address and driving slow. I see this abandoned-looking house, set back from the road with no address and in a bunch of trees. I think, that house better not be it. So I drive past and check the next house's address, and lo and behold, that abandoned-looking one was the right house. Shit. At this point, I'm not super worried, though, because out in the boonies, the standards of upkeep on your house are pretty low, so a house in disrepair isn't all that unusual. I double back to this house and pull into the driveway. At this point, I'm getting bad vibes, and it just doesn't feel right. I park my car at the very end of the driveway, with the rear of the car on the shoulder so anyone passing by can clearly see it. At this point, I call back to the shop and tell them I'm at this sketchy house, and if I don't call back in 4 or 5 minutes, call me, and if I don't answer, call the cops. While I'm on the phone, I take a chance to take a good look at the house. It looks extremely abandoned and not just in disrepair. The driveway is crumbling, bits are gravel, and there are weeds growing out of it. There is no mailbox, no trash cans, no car, no lawnmowers, no landscaping, no kids' toys, absolutely nothing in the yard. The yard hasn't been mowed in what looks like years. The house is total crap. The roof is all but falling apart. The siding is falling apart. The back deck, which comes around the side, is falling apart. The only part of the house that looks even a little bit decent is the allegedly non-functioning front door. The windows are all shut. It's 95 degrees and humid, and this place does not have AC. They all have the blinds or curtains shut. The few that aren't actually are boarded up. I don't even see any wires running to this house. It's not quite dark, but currently dusk, and there isn't a sign of any lights on in the house. At this point, I'm starting to get pretty nervous. I'm a 5'10" male, 180 pounds, not in any great shape, but I did take karate for 10 years, so I'm not helpless. But I do try to avoid any sort of confrontation I can, as I am mostly a pacifist. I'm not too concerned about getting robbed. No skin off my teeth, it's not my money. I mean, I would rather not get robbed, but I'm mostly worried about getting jumped or killed. It's a fairly safe area, but recently there have been some rather unsavory people moving in from the city. A big spike in home invasions and robberies, but more worrying is a few stabbings and assaults. So it's time to either nut up or shut up. I'm not just going to go charging in there like a fool, so I get out my phone and call the number they gave when ordering. While I'm doing that, I'm also getting the pizza out and make sure to leave my door open. A running car half in the road at an abandoned house with the door open looks suspicious, right? I figured if shit does go down, it might look out of place enough to make someone stop. Not that there is really any traffic this far down the road, unfortunately. I'm starting to walk up to the house while the phone's ringing. It rings twice, and then an automated message comes on. It says something along the lines of this phone number is associated with an internet texting app, one of the free ones you download and let you send free texts from a different phone number over a data connection. We have had issues with people using numbers from those services for pranks in the past. This is a huge red flag. My heart is now pounding in my throat, and my whole body is telling me to bail. I don't want to get a reputation of being a flaky bitch as a driver and lose any future delivery shifts, and that is why I've not bailed yet. So I'm just standing there holding a pizza, looking at this house but not wanting to venture around to the back of it. I'm hoping that the resident will look out the window and come out by the road to get their food. I begin looking at the front windows, checking for any signs of life. I see a blind go up on the one window next to the front door, and a really creepy looking guy with a hat pulled low and big sunglasses on is looking out. Now remember, he is in a completely dark house surrounded by trees, at dusk. There is no reason for him to be wearing sunglasses. I also see what appears to be a big guy standing behind him in the room. This could have been anything, though. When he sees me looking, he mouths something and he darts away, presumably towards the alleged broken front door. At this point, I nope the fuck out. I had stayed pretty close to the car, so it was only a few steps away, and I jumped into the driver's seat and throw the pizza into my passenger seat, something I would never do since I'm really anal about keeping my car clean. I slam it into reverse, before I get the clutch all the way in, so I grind my gears a little, again something I never do. Without looking, I simultaneously slam and lock my door and floor it backwards onto the main road, slipping my clutch horribly, but at this point I don't care. I don't want to fuck around and risk a stall. I didn't even check for cross traffic, really stupid on this part, and I start to drive away and look back at the house. The screen door on the outside of the front door is now open, but the front is still shut. The guy isn't out in the yard yelling to wait or come back or anything. He's just gone. So I pull over a little ways up the road to call back to the shop and tell them I'm all good and I'll elaborate when I get back. The people never called back to inquire about their food. People usually call if their pizza is 15 minutes late, and these people never got it, so it's really strange they didn't call. Pretty much confirming they were up to no good. After telling my coworkers about it, we conclude it was definitely a robbery at the very least. So we put the address and phone number on our no delivery list and ate their pizza. I doubt I would have actually gotten murdered or anything. Robbed with maybe a gun pulled or a little roughing up, yes. It was still very unnerving. Especially that I could have easily gotten into some serious trouble by just doing my job. Especially if those idiots picked a slightly less abandoned house to set up at. A little background. I used to work for an armored car company years ago, and was part of a 3-man highway ATM crew. We would go out every night and drive to small towns around our base city, restocking ATMs, so the route took us to some very quiet areas sometimes. On one such winter night, we were on the way out of town and decided to stop to get some food at Subway. It was almost closing time for them, and we got there maybe 10 minutes before, and I could see 3 customers still inside. My driver had already had his bag lunch, so I went in with my partner. Immediately, something didn't feel right. One customer who was just getting his sandwich was okay. He paid and left. The other 2, well, first of all, they looked like they'd crawled out of a dumpster, and the second they saw us, they backed away from the counter and waited. I looked at the young girl behind the counter, and she gave me a look that said, "Please don't leave." And then I looked back at the 2, who were now nervously whispering between themselves and eyeing the guns on our belts. I said to my partner, "We have lots of time. Let's just eat here." He looked at them and agreed. I radioed the driver, and we sat at the nearest booth, kind of daring them to pull something. The 2 dirty fucks whispered between themselves again and bid a hasty retreat out the door. I saw them walk past our armored van and peek in the window, only to have the crap scared out of them when the driver turned abruptly and gave them a hard fuck off look. As soon as they were gone, I asked the girl what the deal was, and she said they had come in several minutes before we got there. Apparently they kept hanging around, waiting until all the other customers had left, never spoke to her at all, just stared. We suggested she call the police and wait there until they showed up. After descriptions were given, the cops told her about some robberies that had been happening around the area, and it sounded like the same 2 guys. So I am in full belief that had we not come by when we did, they would have probably pulled a knife on her and robbed the joint. Back in the 90s, my family would drive to Florida every year. Typically, it was my father, mother, brother, and myself who would drive down to spend a week with my grandparents, who would snowbird in St. Pete Beach. My parents were having a lot of problems in 1996 and 97, So when I was 8 or 9, my aunt and 2 cousins, a boy and a girl, went with us to Florida. My father stayed behind. Our plan was to drive from a very small town outside of Indianapolis to St. Pete Beach through the night, which is around 18 hours. We left around 6 p.m., armed with a ton of DVDs for the new DVD player in my mom's Tahoe. The 4 kids were in the back. There were only 3 seats in the back seat, so one of us took a turn riding in the trunk area while the rest of us sat in an actual seat. The 2 boys were the ones who were fighting over the seats, so my girl cousin and I stayed in the seat while the other 2 were fighting. It was dark soon after we left, but it didn't really matter because we were all either napping or watching movies while our moms talked in the front seat. Sometime around 1 a.m., we stopped in southern Tennessee for gas. It was a small gas station, someplace that my mom had seen from the highway and that was an easy access. Because we were young, we were getting out to go to the bathroom, even if we were sleeping. My aunt took her 2 children to the bathroom first, while my little brother and I waited for my mom to fill up the car. I got out to walk around and stretch, and had the chance to really look at the gas station and surrounding area. Just behind the gas station were a few little houses. The lights were on and I could see people in them, but I didn't pay much attention to them. The station was empty except for our family and the attendant on duty in the store. It wasn't long before our aunt and cousin came back, and my older boy cousin climbed into the trunk as my aunt got into the driver's side. My sleepy little brother, my mom, and I went to the women's bathroom. My brother, around 5 at the time, wanted to go into the men's bathroom, but my mom said no. He could just come in with us. He did, but complained about it while we were in there. I went to the bathroom first, and because I was the oldest, I wanted to get outside the bathroom and look for a snack or something on my own. I stepped outside the bathroom and noticed a man at the counter. It wasn't hard to notice the guy. He was shouting at the clerk and waving a gun around. I luckily hadn't been noticed, and I slipped back into the bathroom quickly without the door closing and locking me out. My mom was finishing up, and she must have noticed my expression because she asked me what was wrong. I told her that there was a guy out there with a gun and that he was shouting at the clerk. Since she was done, she told my brother and I to stay back and peeked out the door. She shut the door and locked it so no one would come in. She told my brother and I that once the coast was clear, we were going to run to the car and get in, no questions asked. We kept listening for anything to change, and soon it was quiet on the other side of the door. We looked outside and the clerk noticed us finally. "If you run now, he won't see you," the clerk had said. I wasn't sure where the guy was, but he wasn't out front anymore. "Is it safe outside?" my mom had asked him. The guy nodded, and we ran out the door and hopped into our still open SUV. My mom shut the back door where my cousin was and the side doors as we climbed in and climbed into the front seat incredibly quickly. "We have to go now," she told my aunt. "What's wrong?" "Go!" Before the engine turned on, I heard 2 loud bangs, and as we were driving down the street, there were police cars driving in the direction of the gas station. Finally, after we were a few miles away, we told my aunt and cousins what had happened. They said that while we were in the bathroom, they had heard what sounded like doors slamming really hard or cars backfiring. With nothing to compare it to, we didn't know what gunshots would sound like, and my aunt and cousins in the car didn't know that they should react. Living in a small town with very little violence at the time didn't prepare us for something like that. We drove through the night on edge and arrived in Florida with a sigh of relief the next day. I tried to check the news for any reports of a gas station robbery in Tennessee. When we finally came across an AM channel talking about a fatal armed robbery attempt at that exact location. The report stated that while the assailant, carrying a .45 snub-nosed revolver, was attempting to open the safe, the clerk took matters into his own hands, placing 2 rounds into the would-be robber's cervical spine, ending his life instantly. My mouth was dropped at the realization of how close to danger my family and I actually were, but realized that every action, in this case the robber, reaps an equal and opposite reaction. So about 20 minutes ago, my mother came to my room to discuss my little sister's birthday party, and she noticed that I was reading a subreddit. After informing her about the content of the site, she decided to tell me a story of her own. To start off, it would be wise to know that my mother was born and raised in a place in Russia near the Caucasus Mountains called Chechnya. This town was pretty crime-ridden and old-fashioned, known for its eye-for-an-eye policy, meaning that if you killed someone, you should expect your family members and or yourself to be killed as payment. Another pretty important piece of information you should know is that my Russian side of the family was very involved in the mob. My great-uncle was one of the leaders of a powerful mob back in the late 60s. I'll ask my mom for his last name, but I think it's pretty well known, and I think it starts with a K. My mom was about 20 when she decided that she'd spend her break from medical school near the Black Sea, where she had met up with some of her friends. She decided that she'd come a day early to have fun on the beach before meeting up with her friends. However, as she was sunbathing, she fell asleep and woke up with an awful heat stroke to the point that she was going to faint. She made it to the road and hailed for a cab for a few minutes until a vehicle that looked like one of those expensive private cars rolled up. I don't know if they're widely known, but they're basically taxis that look like regular cars. Despite there already being a man in the car, my mother decided to try her luck because it was either this or she would pass out on the street. They let her in, and it seemed as though everything was going fine until she realized they drove past the hotel she was staying at. Eventually, they got off the road and started driving into the woods, and that's when my mom kind of realized that they weren't cab drivers. She had no weapons she could use. She was 5 feet tall and incredibly thin. All she was wearing was a bathing suit and a pullover dress, and she was still ill from the heat stroke, so she decided to use her words instead. I don't know if you know who I am, but I'm Kadyrov's niece, and my family's from Chechnya. You know that if you do anything to me, my family, especially my uncle, will find you and kill you and your parents and any relatives you may have. She just went on and on about her family and Chechnya's customs until the driver stopped the car and confirmed her statements, mentioning he knew some men in the army who knew her uncle and abided by the Chechen culture in the eye-for-an-eye sense. After coming to a silent but mutual agreement, they drove her back to her hotel in complete silence, and she never saw them again.
I shall preface this following story with some relevant information. Some countries have an uncommon yet terrifying kidnapping problem, but instead of asking for ransom, the perpetrators murder their victims and harvest them for their organs in order to sell them on the black market. The buyers are typically wealthy, sickly people who would otherwise be unable to find donors. Back in the late 90s, I was around 10 years old and living in Moscow, Russia. One afternoon, I was in my grandmother's room watching the news on the television. It's not that I was watching the news to stay informed, it's that there was really nothing else to watch, except for some awful Soviet-era shows. The news described a man the police were after. He was wanted for kidnapping children and harvesting their organs. A composite sketch of the man's face was shown. I grew bored, so I telephoned to my friend to go outside and play, and we did. As the sun was beginning to set, we were walking home. The path we took was shadowy, as it was through some trees between a few condominium buildings, with hot water pipes running parallel to the path. Our building was about 60 meters from where the trees cleared and the path ended. We were always cautious about our surroundings when we were outside, especially of other people, so it just came as a habit to look behind ourselves every once in a while. But something was making me really uneasy at the moment, so I looked behind me expecting to see something, and I did. Some man was behind us, maybe around 30 meters. I thought nothing of it, and looked to the front again. He seemed familiar for some reason. At that moment, I remembered the composite sketch, and I was immediately gripped by fear. I glanced behind me again, and to my horror, the man was jogging towards us, closing the gap between us. I turned to my friend, but reasoned that if I panicked and just told him to run, he may have thought I was joking, or perhaps I didn't want to arouse the man's suspicion, thinking that if he noticed my intent to run, it would have given him enough time to accelerate to a full sprint. Without hesitation, I muttered to my friend, "Someone is after us. On 3, run to our building." I didn't give him time for a reaction, figuring that if he took it as a joke, then he would just think I was trying to get an early advantage in a race game, which would be ideal. 1, 2, 3. We sprinted, never looking back. I prepared the keys and hoped that I could get open the triple doors in time. The first door we kicked open, as it was the only unlocked one. I unlocked the second door and slammed it shut behind me. I entered the passcode on the next door and stumbled into the building. We immediately laughed uncomfortably since it was both thrilling and scary, much like the times when we ran from a place where we caused mischief, and that's probably what security thought, as the guard didn't believe me. I looked out of the windows and I saw no trace of the man. Could it really have been the same man from the news?
I'm 18, living in St. Petersburg, and stand at about 6'2". However, I am slim at about 155 pounds, so not terrifying, but a natural victim. My Russian is decent, but locals speaking quickly is still a little difficult to understand. 2 nights ago, I was going out to the nearest pub for a drink, and getting there involves going through an alleyway shaped like 2 L's, such that there is a point in the middle at which you cannot be seen from either road. When I reached this point, I decided to stop for a smoke before getting to the pub. I had been through this alley several times, and it's always been very quiet. A man coming from the other way approaches me and asks for a light. I offer it to him and he begins smoking. I naturally expect him to move off, but instead he just stands there, opposite me smoking. I assume he just wants smoking company, so I think nothing of it really. I will do my best to describe the guy. He was probably around 25, he stood perhaps 5'10", but much burlier than me. His longish hair and patchy stubble sent me a weird vibe almost immediately that I didn't trust. He wore heavy leather clothing, common, but the weirdest thing by far was his boots. They had fucking spurs on them. So all in all, I'm getting the feeling that this guy is a bit eccentric, but that doesn't automatically mean anything. I notice after about 10 seconds of silence that this guy isn't actually smoking. He's not inhaling the smoke at all, and it occurs to me that he had trouble lighting the thing in the first place. Again, really fucking weird. But I rationalize it and assume he must just be a relatively new smoker. He strikes up a conversation. Now I'll do my best to write a transcript here, as an English speaker would say these things, but he spoke very, very strange, something like this. You're cool, man. We should hang out, man. I've got a cool bunch of friends I chill with. We play games and shit. You'd have fun. It strikes me as a weird opener, and I'm noping the fuck out at this point, as all these weird vibes are combining into a feeling that this guy is a bit of a creeper. I reply courteously, "Sorry, mate. Got plans." This is a lie, but out of habit to make my refusals seem more valid. He continues, "No, really, dude. You should come hang out. We have a lot of fun. A lot of fun. A lot of fun." The repetition of that last bit 3 times sends shivers down my spine. It is the bit of the brief interchange that I really remember. He's leaning in now, looking directly at me. I'm creeped and resolved to get the fuck out of there. It occurs to me that because of the way he approached, he is between me and the main alley. I make to move around him, but he lifts the fucking cigarette butt up as if to burn me with it. I said to him the equivalent of, "What the fuck, mate?" Shit gets to a whole other level here. He starts speaking super fucking quickly, far too fast for me. I picked up a few things though, stuff about his friends, and a lot of swearing at me. He finished his rant with this fucking statement. "Are you a homophobe? We like to eat homophobes." He said eat. No, not kill. Eat. How the hell did this escalate to here? I don't know whether I'm going to be raped or roasted at this point. I've had enough though. He started towards me, but I shoved him hard in the chest out of the way and booked it down the alleyway and out into the road. I think he followed most of the way, but when I looked back he was walking the other direction with his head low. I was jittery as fuck for hours, and when I talked to the barman he said that this is kind of a weird area. A lot of gay people, and a lot of gay haters. Nasty kettle of fish, he says. This guy fucking terrified me. He singled me out in an alley, pretending to smoke in order to talk to me. Tried to invite me to something. A gangbang with his friends. Tried burning me with a cigarette butt, and then when I refused, he threatened to eat me instead. Needless to say, Russia is not for the faint of heart. He needed to be very careful and watch over me because blonde babies sell for a lot of money on the Japanese black market. After that, my mom insisted that my crib be moved back into my parents' room, and they continued to live in the same apartment without incident until a family emergency forced my mom to come back stateside. This story always makes me chuckle a little, just imagining my mother stark naked and screaming like a banshee chasing some guy with a bat. But it's a little chilling to think what might have happened to me if she hadn't been such a light sleeper. I'll never forget that night. It was last year, and I had just turned 25. I had been to a friend's wedding in another state and was returning by train. I reached the station around 5 a.m. It was freezing as the temperature had just hit 4 degrees. All I could think of was getting home fast, so I could sleep for hours after being tired from many nights. I generally avoid traveling home alone in the dark, but it was impossible to wait at the station until sunrise because 1 hour seemed like a very long time, so I decided to get a taxi. The distance from the station to my apartment is roughly 40 kilometers. There were 2 taxis, and I got into one of them without making any eye contact with the driver. I told him where I wanted to go, and we started. The man must have been in his late 50s or early 60s. Silver gray hair, big build. I decided to go with this taxi because I thought I'd be more safe with this fellow since he was elderly. And that was a mistake. Nearly 15 to 20 minutes had passed. I was looking at the road ahead. There were very few cars, and all I could see were trees that were close by, and fog covered everywhere else. Suddenly I noticed that this guy had been staring at me from the rearview mirror, and he didn't blink or look away when I looked at him. It had been over 2 minutes, and he was still staring. He had scary, droopy eyes. I was very uncomfortable at this point, so I used my scarf to cover half my face, which was only covering my neck all the while. This didn't stop him, and he suddenly started laughing like a maniac. Then he said a word in some other language, so I asked him to repeat, and my heart was beating very fast. "So many people are dying," he said, and he started laughing again. I was too afraid to ask him any questions. I stood there frozen, regretting why I didn't wait at the station. My hands were shivering because I was trying to send a message to a friend, but my fingers just couldn't type properly. He turned around, now facing me, asked me if I was married. I managed to speak nervously, "No," and he said, "You will repent." I was so tired and needed more pain medication, so at this point I just couldn't deal with his shit. I wanted to go back to the hotel and nap. I turned around and began cursing, telling him to leave me alone now. All of a sudden he got this very angry look on his face and actually spat on me. I was so furious at this point that I turned around, ignored the pain in my stomach, and walked home so angrily I probably looked like a cartoon character. This is about something that happened to me when I was a baby, but my mom still counts it as one of the scariest events of her life. For a little backstory, both my parents were Marines stationed in Okinawa in the 80s. That's where they met, married, and where I was born. Once I was born, my mom opted for honorable discharge, but stayed in Okinawa with me as dependents. At the time, there was nothing available in base housing, so my parents had a small apartment out in town. Both of my parents still agree that their time in Japan was the best of their lives and had many friends, both Marines and Japanese. And according to them, I was a very popular baby with their Japanese friends, with my blonde hair and blue eyes. One night when I was about 4 months old, my dad had to go for a training exercise, leaving my mom and I alone for a week or more. My mom had no problem with this, as they lived in a very safe neighborhood. So safe that they had once witnessed a 4-year-old child walking home alone from his grandmother's house at 3 a.m., and no one thought anything of it. Well, my dad had been gone for a few days, and one night my mom said that a strange noise woke her up. She said it wasn't very loud, but the Corps had kind of programmed her into being a very light sleeper. Thinking that I had woken up for a night feeding, she came to my room. When she came to my open door, she found a strange Japanese man reaching into my crib, trying to pick me up. Now here's where I think the story starts to take a slight turn to comical in retrospect. According to my dad, the weather in Japan was extremely hot and extremely humid, even in the middle of night. So my mom had the habit of sleeping naked to avoid overheating. So my mom is standing in her apartment, naked, watching a strange man trying to pick up her infant in the middle of the night. And bless that woman, her first reaction was to pick up my dad's aluminum baseball bat and chased the man from the apartment, screaming in English and what little Japanese she knew. She rechecked all the locks and spent the rest of the night sleeping on the floor next to my crib. The next day, feeling a little less shaken, she told one of her closest Japanese friends. The woman told her that For those of you who have never been to Tokyo, the city is bustling and busy up until midnight. Once midnight hits, the train system shuts down, so if you're on the train at 11:59 and it's about to turn midnight, the train will go to the next stop on its track, and then everyone has to get off. You spend many nights in Tokyo planning how late you can stay out and still get home without having to walk 3 to 4 stops distance. This night my friend and I messed up and ended up having to get off the Yamanote line, probably the most famous line in Tokyo, 4 stops before where we lived. Knowing only the vague direction we had to head home, east, we got off at a station at midnight and started walking. Around the corner from the station there was a businessman in his 30s or so, face down on the ground. Now in Japan it is not uncommon for people to get drunk and pass out in public places, so I didn't think anything of it and went up to him to ask him if he was okay. After asking him a few times if he was alright, he neither moved nor responded, and then I noticed that not only was he sprawled out on the ground, but his cell phone was also several feet away from his outstretched hand, as if he had just collapsed while on his phone. Not sure what to do, I looked to my friend for help. At that exact moment, a car came zooming down the narrow street and stopped at a grinding halt by us. The driver, a young Japanese guy, looked at us first, then looked at the man on the ground. He asked the man if he was all right and got no response. Then the situation hit him, and he saw me and my friend, 2 foreigners, standing over what could have been a dead man on the ground. He clearly got spooked and drove off without pushing the issue further. Based on how strange the situation was, and how impossible it would be to explain even in English and not look like we had hurt or killed the guy, my friend and I decided to get out of there as quickly as possible, and we took off, following the tracks as best we could to get home ASAP. About 20 minutes later, near the next station, who do we run into smoking a cigarette? The guy who had pulled up in the car next to us. He seemed visibly still shaken. He glanced at me, and I at him, and once he realized where he had saw me from, he put his cigarette out at inhuman speed, got in his car, and sped off. That was the last we saw of him. For years my friend and I would randomly discuss what had happened to the guy in the car, as well as if the guy in the street was actually dead or not. I wish I would have helped the guy on the ground, but I was a scared college student afraid of being put in Japanese jail. To start off, I had just finished my junior year in high school, and my Japanese language and open it in a manner of seconds, expecting it to shoot a stream of steady carbonated danger in the guy's face. Nope, just kind of shot off a bit of foam and soda. The guy is stunned briefly, and that gives her enough time to escape his grip, and I don't know what I was thinking, but I just kind of swung the can in front of his face. About half of the can empties on the guy's face with open eyes. As he's doubling over in pain, which probably didn't last long, we hauled ass back to the main street and hurried back to the theater. Now, I have no clue what the guy's intentions were, but I'm just glad I was able to keep her out of danger. So I recently went on a trip with my family to Japan. Overall, I really enjoyed myself and thought it was a beautiful country. But one thing happened to me that kind of puts me off. I had recently got out of the hospital before we went on the trip. Recently meaning 2 days out of the hospital. I got my appendix removed and blood sucked out of my stomach. So as you can probably imagine, I was not in the best shape and very sore and incredibly fucking tired. My family had decided that they would go out and explore a temple, but I decided to stay back in the hotel because I was in too much pain and needed to rest. About 2-ish hours after my family had left, I decided I was hungry. Seeing a 7-Eleven out my hotel window, I decided to go and get something to eat because it wasn't too much of a walk and there was no room service or anything. So I set off on my small journey to get some food. After buying some kebab things and a strange cake, I went to the small seating area to sit and eat because I was too tired to walk back yet. It was just me and an older Japanese man sitting behind me. I felt someone touching my hair. I turned around. He started trying to tell me how beautiful my hair was, but his English was terrible, so I just smiled and said, "Thank you." This was not uncommon, as I have strawberry blonde hair, and a lot of people in Japan seem to be fascinated with it. People always come up and touched it. I got back to eating, but soon after, the man moved next to me and started trying to talk to me again. To be completely honest, I sort of felt obliged to try and communicate because he seemed so cute and old and innocent. I just wanted to be nice. Bad idea. Shortly after, he decided to take a seat next to me. He starts saying short phrases in English. Incredibly sexual short phrases. His English seemed to have gotten better, and he continued to ask me for sex and tell me I was beautiful, and I was very uncomfortable at this point and got up and left the 7-Eleven. At this point, he decided it would be really cool and a fun idea to come outside with me. Each class was taking a trip to Japan to learn more about the language and culture. A friend of mine, and now girlfriend, who was unable to take Japanese that year asked to come along, and was allowed to by our teacher. The trip was 13 days, and covered a lot of ground in Japan. This friend, who we'll call Sarah, has a history of horrible headaches and migraines, but neither surfaced during our trip, except for one. We were in Kyoto, about to watch a performance of various types of Japanese theater, and had showed up a bit early. While we were in line to buy our tickets, Sarah started looking a bit distressed, and I asked her what was wrong. One of her headaches was coming on, and I had no clue what to do. I only knew it was going to get horrible. In an attempt to relieve her pain, I offered to take her to buy some coffee. Caffeine helps headaches. The great thing about Japan is that there are vending machines everywhere, and more often than not, they'll have hot and cold coffee cans in them. So I'm walking her down to the main street in the Gion district, looking left and right down alleys for one of these vending machines. After a few minutes, I see one in a shady-looking alleyway. As we get to the vending machine, I start pulling enough yen out of my pocket and have enough for 3 drinks. I was relatively hot, so I ended up buying a Coke for myself and 2 coffees for her, the other just in case it happens again. As she's picking up the cans from the vending area, I notice a man out of the corner of my eye, roughly 25 feet down. He gets up from the wall he was leaning on and starts making his way down towards us. Naturally, I shrug it off and assume he is going in one of the buildings in the alley. We start walking back to the theater house by means of the alleys because they were much quieter and Sarah was having a horrible headache by the time we got to the machine. The guy's still following us. No big deal. I'm sure he's got a house up here, I thought. I hadn't looked back for a while, and when I did, the guy was about 10 feet away from us. That's when I was able to get a good look at him before turning away. Black dress shirt, dark blue jeans, kind of a generic but unfriendly face, and his eyes were trained on Sarah. At this point, I got every shade of red alert going off in my head, but I have absolutely no clue what I would do should I have to intervene. I'm still holding my can of Coke in my hand, and that's about the only weapon I've got besides a knife in my backpack. So, I start to shake it pretty hard just in case. Should I have to use it then, it'll spray all over the guy's face and give us just enough time to hightail it back to the main road, where she wouldn't be in any danger. As I'm shaking the can, the guy advances closer and closer, and finally puts his hand on her shoulder. I flip the fuck out and point the can at the guy's face,